So I had traveled in over 50 countries of the world when I married Neil, but nothing could have prepared me for my first glimpse of Kabul in 2000. It was the time of the first Taliban government, and we arrived with my firstborn son, was 3 months old at that time. And I remember driving around the corner where there was the main bombed out post office, and what lay before me was this sprawling, completely flattened suburb. At that moment, my mind flew to Jeremiah and what he described when he witnessed the rape, pillaging, and utter destruction of Jerusalem. But what I didn't realize at that moment was how much we'd be walking in the footsteps of Jeremiah in that next decade, and how much my own faith would be tested. And I also remember this feeling of surprise that came over me when my husband and I flew out of Kabul for the last time, that we were actually together, because we just assumed one of us would be high probability of kidnapped or killed based on the work that we were doing. Walking this path of trying to understand more about witness risk is one my husband and I have been on for 30 years. Neil was in Albania first when the government fell, and in the ensuing chaos, all of the foreign workers were evacuated, a very dramatic situation. And he told me, he was a single, so they asked him to stay because, of course, he was expendable. He told me about watching a mob tear through a brick wall with their bare hands. Through our 10 years in Afghanistan, we lived near constant armed conflict, bombings, daily constant threats of kidnapping and murder. A large-scale robbery in 2002 when 10 armed men, all armed with Kalashnikovs, entered our home and held us at gunpoint. And I was milliseconds from becoming a widow at that moment. Like so many women, Afghan and expat, often regular, daily, verbal, sometimes physical sexual harassment, just as we would walk on the streets or go to the bazaar. Stones and vegetables thrown at us. 20 of our friends and colleagues martyred in a 6-year period. That's just the foreigners. Slandered in court by Afghans and directly threatened with our lives. Slandered by other workers. Horrible sicknesses. Demonic oppression. Living with the smell of death and misery all around us. And constant grief and loss, and continual planned randomized schedules to avoid surveillance and kidnapping as we carried on the work, which continues there in Afghanistan to this day. In 2012, Neil and I moved to Ankara, Turkey, now with 3 teenagers, and we lived there we based in Turkey for 5 years, but our ministry was across Central Asia and the Middle East, primarily pastoring those serving in hard and dangerous areas, both outsiders, foreigners, and local, indigenous. But while we lived in Ankara, we experienced direct threats from ISIS against our international fellowship. They had mapped our building and had an active plan to attack, and 18 bombs in 12 years. And then the long sleepless night when the attempted coup in Turkey in 2016. So this question of a theology of risk has been extremely personal, urgent, and continual during my missionary career as a Christ follower, as a mom, as a wife, as a global worker, as a pastor to global workers. But the challenge has always been answering that question of what is a theology of risk. So I'd like to first start by defining terms. Thank you. So witness risk is defined as the potential loss or gain when risking my life for the sake of the gospel. This is when we're called and choose to go to a situation where we are willingly exposing ourselves to danger with the possibility of persecution and death. And why? For the gain of the advancement of God's kingdom. Now, the definition has changed a bit. That or gain has been added since the publication of Facing Danger, because we don't risk without the hope of gain. Risk inherent in any field, business, any type of risk means we're risking for gain, not just the loss. And also, I had no idea this book would go around the world, and so it had to change from cross-cultural risk, because sometimes people are coming to Christ and they're being led to stay. They're intercultural, and then we start getting very wordy. So we talked with people around the world, and witness risk seemed to be appropriate because you know what the Greek word is, martus, and it defines those of us who are witnesses to what Christ has done in our life. And so witness risk is what we've settled on. But there's 3 critical mistakes made when trying to answer the risk question. So we would ask questions to people back home on how to make some of our decisions. And we were responsible, my husband and I, for 100 foreigners and 100 Afghans and a multi-million-dollar NGO operation. And so we had many serious questions about risk. But the problem was we would get these answers that were really a suffering answer to the risk question. And I realized that suffering, so you can go to the next slide, suffering asks different questions than risk asks. So then we have to ask, well, what's the difference between a theology of suffering and a theology of risk? In risk, we haven't suffered yet. Risk is the threat of persecution. It's the threat of suffering, the threat of death. And living under constant uncertainty, as we did for year after year, knowing you can lose everything but not having lost it yet, is one of the hardest situations to endure day in and day out, month after month, year after year. And while all Christians are called to suffer, and we do suffer, and it's wisdom to work out your theology of suffering, we have to work out a theology of risk at the same time. Risk is confusing. How do I know what to do? The threats are pouring in. Am I supposed to stay or am I supposed to go? So risk is really answering or asking that question, am I called to move to danger or am I called to move to safety? The second critical mistake people make when trying to answer the risk question is by one of these risk myths. So that's the next slide. So a myth is not exactly what I mean, but I haven't found another term that's short and pithy. And a myth, by definition, in a literary sense of that word, is not a true story. It's a supernatural type story, right? But these statements may be partly true, but the way they're used makes them a myth, all right? So the first one that's in my book is, you're never safer than when you're at the center of God's will. And I think this is one of the most dangerous myths that gets repeated around the world by the global church. And you'll also notice it's got 16 witness risk myths. There's 12 in the current book, and there'll be 16 in the second edition. And that's as we listen to Christ's followers around the world on all continents, what are we hearing and what are they identifying that doesn't seem to ring true for their experience? The reason why this is a problem is if you think you're in the center of God's will and you're in a dangerous place and something bad happens to you, and then we've seen missionaries go into faith crisis here because they don't understand. And obviously we need to define what safer means, but not from an American anti-risk perspective. And then the third problem that was really hard for me was asking that risk question and trying to search the scriptures and read what's out there on risk back in the early 2000s, was people would answer the question anecdotally. The response would be, well, just do what Paul did. And we'd be like, well, which thing? When he fled over the wall? When he headed to Rome? Do what Jesus did. Well, which time? Do what Esther did. Well, you're there for such a time as this. Well, how do I know? Because Daniel, he didn't go to the place. It was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel's off doing something else. So which thing am I supposed to follow? Which I say the focus is off. It's not what did Paul do, what did Jesus do, what did Esther do. It's how did they hear from the Lord Jesus or the community? How did they discern what they were to do and then go and do that? In the next slide is not something I've published. It's kind of my own personal slide. It's kind of like an orientation of theology of risk and its relationships to other, we can say, theologies. These are areas that influence our theology of risk. You see, a theology of risk is not in isolation to anything else. It's certainly not new in Scripture, which is what I'm talking about today. These are topics, I think, that as Neil and I have listened to people, what it is that he and I need to be grounded in and what we think as we listen, what we hear from the Word. There's a couple problems with any structure mapping out a complex thing. It makes it seem like theology of risk is more important because it's a bigger circle, and that's not at all. It's like shining a spotlight, right, where this is and what it's related to. And also, all of these are interrelated with each other, but it wouldn't be a useful diagram if it was too complex to read, right? I think I don't publish this because it's a work in progress and I keep adding to it or changing it. But what I would say about this right now is that a theology of failure, up in the top right, and a theology of evil are probably two areas that are not addressed, I think, adequately pre-field. And let me explain what I mean by that. Kenneth Bailey discussed a theology of evil, a theology of failure in his last book on the shepherd. And it's a theology of failure in mission. And we've seen missionaries lose their faith and their marriages over this one. And Jesus described what would happen to us. And when things don't work out as we want them to, but that's not how we define success or failure on the mission field. And a theology of evil, I think it's very hard, and I'll just speak about me as an American, to go someplace that's dangerous and recognize there's people out there who want to kill me simply because I'm a Christ follower. And how do I deal with personally targeted evil? I think a theology of evil is something we should spend time on. And Todd Johnson published, it's for free. I found this for free. It's 112 ways Christians have been martyred in the last 2,000 years. That would be worth printing out and using it in your devotions prayerfully before the Lord and listening to the cries of those who've been martyred and their blood is lifted up to the Lord, crying out for justice. I think it's worth spending time reflecting on that, especially before going to a dangerous place. Uncertainty is also one I'm working on. I think there's uncertainty in three areas that need to be discussed pre-field. Obviously, risk is inherently uncertain. That's part of the definition. And there's uncertainty in how we make a decision. That's discernment, also not taught commonly in the church. And the third area is the dangers of aspects of theological certainty, because we all have a cultural theology that God doesn't operate always those ways that we learn in our home cultures. But the problem with defining a theology of risk is there's no Hebrew word for risk, all right? So it's a bit hard to start in the Old Testament. So we turn to the New Testament, and you can go to the next slide. The New Testament uses three different Greek words that are most commonly translated as risk. So we want to understand these three words as best we can and to think, how did the early church hear these words in their context? And then we have to remember that Greek is a precise, logical language, but Hebrew is describing how things are seen and experienced. So if we can understand what the early church understood and maybe what they were thinking from a Hebraic mindset, how it's seen and experienced in the Old Testament, that might help us mine the Old Testament a little bit more. And perhaps using a little bit outside of the box, but using a first century rabbinical hermeneutic along with other tools, maybe we can kind of use that to crawl into Luke and Paul's mind a little bit more. So you can see here there's hypotithemy, Romans 16:4, parabolusamenos, hard to say fast, 10 times, Philippians 2:30, and paradidomi in Acts 15. So we'll first look at hypotithemy, the first Greek word. This word is used by Paul to describe what Priscilla and Aquila did for him. It means literally to put the neck down willingly and expose oneself to extreme danger and risk. And the verb tense means they laid their necks on the line and kept them there, an ongoing action for an indeterminate length of time. And what were they putting their necks down on? In 1 Timothy, he uses that word in the context of sound doctrine and faith. So they're putting their necks down on the foundation of Christ's work on the cross. They risked their lives for Paul over a long period of time. So we must ask questions about them. What kind of courage was needed for them to lay their necks down and keep them there, possibly for years on end? What kind of loyalty, endurance, stamina, wisdom, discernment was needed as they went about the task of hospitality, leading a church, teaching, baptizing, raising a family, likely moving country at least 2 times? The second word is parabolusamenos, Philippians 2:30. And this word, it seems that Paul made up because it's not found anywhere else. And I think it was found one place in the 2nd century AD on a stele or something. I tried to find it again. And this verse just really means gambling. Epaphroditus, by going to Paul, was gambling his life. We have to remember, in the ancient world, diseases were terrifying. They expected to die. It was no small thing that he did this and became gravely ill. But also we have to remember that Epaphroditus, by going to Paul, was aligning himself, was being seen with a prisoner of the empire. This was very dangerous and took a lot of courage for Epaphroditus to do so. And he willingly embraced the risk. The language Paul uses in Philippians 2, 3, and 4 emphasizes the extent of what Epaphroditus did. He used military and priestly language, and he described Epaphroditus' risk as an act of worship, a fragrant offering given to the Lord. And then the third word is paradidomi. This is Acts 15. This was certain men were chosen by the leaders in the church in Jerusalem to go to the Gentile church in Antioch to carry the message on the practices of eating and circumcision. And paradidomi really means to give one's hands over to. And it means that these men had actively chosen, Paul and Barnabas, to give their hearts and souls and to remain in that position. They weren't just setting themselves up for the possibility of difficulty, but that they had decisively placed themselves there. That's where they chose to live. So, of course, awful things may happen. So what we see is, in the next slide, is we see 3 essential elements of a theology of risk from these 3 words. We see worship, selection, choosing, and foundation. Who has God chosen for this risk? Instead of asking, my husband said he used to ask, who among my team is best equipped to face this risk? We reoriented our question as, who has God chosen? And it's often who you don't expect it to be. Instead of saying, what can I preserve and protect in the risk? Because sometimes God chooses to pour out, seemingly wastefully. How is he inviting me into risk as an act of worship? And then instead of what is our contingency plan, which is a good thing to have, but not have it be our foundation. What is our foundation? On what or whom am I relying? And is it truly Christ at the center of why I'm risking and how I'm risking? So having a solid theology of risk will help our resiliency in facing danger. And probably the 2 things that reduce resiliency the most are isolation and resignation. Isolation is when I feel all alone. Resignation when I don't think there's anything I can do about what's happening. When you know you're called and the Lord's invited you into the risk as an act of worship and you're relying on God as your foundation, it's easier to face these challenges with joy and peace. Now, when we come to the passage of Exodus 17, this slide, thank you, we'll stay there for a little bit. I asked the Lord what he would like me to share with you, with this community here. And he invited me to close my notes and to share with you devotionally in 2 areas. One is what draws my attention in the Exodus 17 text, and also what comforts me from that passage that was read. So I have to say, and I'm just going to open the passage here, starting in actually verse 7, which I didn't ask him to read. The last part of that, verse 7, is the Lord among us or not? And this question shouldn't be glossed over. It really actually is the framing of what the entire next 9 verses are all about. Is the Lord among us? Is he with us or not? And when we sit with missionaries and we hear the questions that they're asking. See, we all know the answer, and we know what happens. We all know the answer, but do we know the answer here? Is the Lord among us or not? And we describe these questions that people ask as sacred questions. These questions are the questions that arise in our soul that we're too embarrassed to put in the newsletter because we know the answer and we know our supporters know the answer. But that's not actually what the problem is. Can we experience God? Is he good? Does he care? Will he act? I've even had missionaries say, am I really a Christian? These are sacred questions, and we don't want to skip over them because the questions that arise in the risk scenario, the risk situation, is actually the question that God is allowing to arise in our soul, which is the moment of transformation to his likeness if we will interact with him on that question. And then we'll skip to 9. It says, Moses said to Joshua, choose men. Now this is comforting to me because some men were chosen and some men were not chosen. And that's worth meditating on. Which men did Joshua choose? How did he make that decision? And what it says to me is God hasn't chosen me right now. There's certain things I would like to do. I don't want to be where I am. I don't want to be in an isolated small town that's very homogeneous. I'd rather be on the mission field. But I can rest there and not feel guilty because I'm where he's called me to be. I haven't been chosen for certain risks. When we know that we're chosen or not chosen, but we're following him and obeying him, we can rest in that, and we don't have to feel guilty. And then what next really draws my attention is Moses up on the hill. It says Moses' hands were heavy, and then the end of that verse, his hands were steady. Heavy, kabod. It's the root word for glory. It's the only time in the Old Testament that this is applied to a physical. It's usually God's glory. The reason why I spend time thinking about that, his hands were heavy. Were they heavy because the glory of the Lord was flowing through them? I don't know. Because it says his hands were steady once Aaron and Hur were supporting him. They were faithful. His hands were faithful. They were faithfulness. And then you think about the men fighting down in the valley, looking up. What did they think? The early church in the first century, what did they see? They saw Jesus. They saw a type of Christ. And when you look at the text, Aaron is the priest. Hur is of the line of Judah. And Moses is the prophet who's the mediator of God's power and blessing. It's a priestly, kingly, and prophet picture of Christ himself. Well, that's comforting. The Lord is with us. He's there. And then we go to the last 3 verses, which are very difficult. Write in this book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, what the Lord will do. In this passage, I see 4 spiritual practices along with these 3 elements of a theology of risk. Let me go back. It says Moses, it came about, verse 11, it came about when Moses held his hand up, Israel prevailed. And when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. Yeah. So Moses had to observe what was happening down on the battlefield. He had to observe. And he was probably really good at this because he'd observed the bush. You have to stare at a bush a long time to see that it's not burning up. And in the spiritual world, we need to observe what is God doing and how do we discern his ways. The Bible, Psalms and Proverbs, is filled with prayers and commands to study and know God's ways and understand what's happening. We have to observe. He observed. That's one spiritual discipline. But then he had to become aware of what was happening as his hands were moving up and down. How many times do we go through a day and we forget about God? We're not even aware that he's with us, moment by moment. Awareness. If we can even sense the presence of God on a daily basis, that would be a major spiritual accomplishment. So we have observation, we have awareness, we have action. Well, he couldn't do it without the help. The disciples, the commentators, what they say, well, he was an old man, so he needed help. Well, you try to hold your hands up for 30 minutes without help. I mean, that's pretty tiring. He needed the community. So he chose action. And then when we skip down to that 14, 15, and 16, we see him saying the Lord said to Moses, write and recite. And this is re-explained in Deuteronomy 25:17. It's to remember, which is also the word for memorial here, to remember to never forget. To remember what the Lord did. And this is a cultivating heart habit that can stabilize us in danger. And I think the most comforting picture is the third element of a theology of risk, and that is that the Lord has sworn the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. And this is a very complicated Hebrew section. There's numerous Jewish and Christian scholars have analyzed that. I think there's merits to many of those. And what I've settled on for myself is the Lord is on his throne, because we know he is. And I think it's his hand on the throne because of his mighty right arm, and it's permanent. And we know this from numerous other verses. And that is what calms me and steadies my soul when I'm in a dangerous place, when I'm in and out. That's the most comforting thing to me, to remember what King Nebuchadnezzar said in Daniel 4, that his dominion is forever and ever and will never have any end. So, what does all of this mean for a practical theology of risk? And so we'll go to the next slide. So we've worked out what are some of the key things that we need to train workers in and Christ followers. And so these are some of the practical theology in our 2-day training. But they really don't make a difference without the main key part down at the bottom is Holy Spirit-led discernment, whether he's leading us into danger or out, and how he's leading us on a day-to-day basis. I just want to close here with the last slide. And I want to say to you and to challenge you and encourage you and to challenge and encourage myself, could we be a generation of men and women that will stand firm for Christ, that will be characterized with endurance and firm resolve in following him, no matter what the gates of hell try to throw at us? And let me pray for you right now. Lord, I just ask for you to work in this Gordon Conwell community here. I ask for you to call men and women from here to go, that they would become prepared, but Lord, that you would prepare all of us to stand firm and to speak boldly, that you would help us to cultivate those disciplines that we need to walk closely with you, that God is with us, and that we can rest firmly on the foundation that is you. In your name, amen.